Have you ever heard of the marshmallow study? It was a psychological experiment conducted by Stanford University back in I think the year 1960. And it was designed to help psychologists understand when the control of delayed gratification, that ability to wait to obtain something you want, to discover when that ability kicked in children. It became known as the marshmallow experiment because it did indeed involve marshmallows. Here's how it worked. They would take children one by one who were between the ages of 4 and 6 into a room that was empty of all distractions, and there on a table would be a treat of their choice. It could be an Oreo, it could be a pretzel stick, it could be a marshmallow. And the child was sitting in a chair next to the table, and they told the child that he or she could eat the treat right now, or if they could wait 15 minutes while the adult went to run an errand and came back, then they would be rewarded with a second treat. So if they just waited 15 minutes, they could get 2 cookies or 2 pretzels or 2 marshmallows. How do you think this worked out? Approximately 2/3 of the children ate the single treat before the 15 minutes expired. Some held out longer than others, but only 1/3 waited the full 15 minutes and got the second treat. That experiment has been replicated in other ways over the years, and it's an indicator to us that we have a weight problem. That's no surprise. As we talked about this morning in introducing our study of patience, sometimes we really lack patience. And what I want to do this evening is point to one simple truth. Since the one true God is associated with patience, our need for instant gratification is evidence of our worship of a different deity. One that we might call the God of now. And we're not the first to worship this so-called little g God. Abraham worshiped the God called now when he and Sarah decided to use Hagar as a surrogate mother. God promised Abraham and Sarah that they would have a child, but in their old age, they couldn't wait any longer. So they decided to do something about it right now. Absalom, the son of David, worshiped the God called now when he didn't want to wait for his father to pass away before he became king. So instead of waiting on his throne like his father did, he attempted to take the kingdom away from David while David was still alive. And in the end, it cost Absalom his life. And the prodigal son worshiped the God called now. He did this when he wouldn't wait for his inheritance. And he demanded that it be given to him for his enjoyment right now. The end result was he went off and squandered it with reckless and wasteful living. And my guess is that all of us, to some degree, have battled with either serving or wanting to serve the God called now. It happens in those moments when you're waiting for God's timetable to come to fruition and you're growing impatient in the process. Maybe there's been a point in your life where you've wondered, Lord, when will you lead me to the next phase of my career? When will you lead me to a job that I actually enjoy, an employer that I actually like? When will you open an opportunity for a position that can provide the income or the hours that my family needs? Or maybe you've been in the position where you've wondered, Lord, when will you lead me to a person, the person that I can spend the rest of my life with? Someone who will be my spouse, someone who I can love and build a home with. When will I not be single anymore? When will I find that special person to marry? Or maybe you've been in the position where you've wondered, Lord, when will I be able to have kids? When will you bless me with children? When will we be able to become parents? Or maybe you've simply wondered, Lord, when will this pain go away? When will I be well again? When will I not have to see a doctor or schedule an appointment or have a test done? When will I be healed? Lord, when will this grief subside? When will the memories not hurt so much? When will I not have to cry again? Lord, when will I get past this storm? When will I get through this difficult experience that I'm enduring right now? When will I get past this phase of life that is challenging every fiber of my being? When will I not have to face this hurdle anymore? I'm certain we've all been in the when phase at some point in time, wondering when God's going to make something happen, when He's going to bring something to fruition, when He's going to fulfill His will in our lives. And if you haven't been there, oh, you will be someday. And you know what? Sometimes it's harder to accept God's answer to the question of when than it is to what, or how, or why. And in those moments when the when question is so difficult, when we grow weary of waiting, it's very easy to bow to the God called now, because that God promises quick results. In almost every case, the God called now can offer you a temporary solution, but it will come at a cost. You can't afford that thing you want to purchase right now? Well, just charge it. And for the moment, it will provide a temporary fix. Don't worry about the fact that you're ignoring contentment and financial stewardship. You're tired of hurting. You're tired of the physical pain you endure. So consume this drink or use this drug or pop this pill, and your pain problem will be temporarily resolved. Never mind that it may be illegal or addictive. You're tired of being alone. Well, sacrifice your purity and you can be with someone tonight. Don't worry about the fact that you'll be compromising something God told you to protect. And it's hard to say no to the God called now, especially when it seems like all you've been doing is leaving messages on God's voicemail because from your perspective, He's not answering the phone. And the God called now says it's better to live by sight than by faith. But the Lord God commands us to walk by faith and not by sight. And that's why in 2 Peter chapter 1 and verse 6, as Peter lists these characteristics and these attributes were to add to our faith, early on he includes patience or steadfastness or perseverance, depending on the translation you read. Faith demands that we believe that the God who orders our steps is the same God who orders our stops, as one preacher said. And we've got to trust God in both situations, when He says go and when He says no. That's why one of the chief assignments of discipleship is waiting. Paul said in Romans chapter 8 and verse 23 that we groan inwardly as we wait eagerly for adoption as sons. Galatians chapter 5 and verse 5, we're told that through the Spirit by faith, we ourselves eagerly wait for the hope of righteousness. Titus chapter 2, verse 12 and 13. It indicates that in addition to living self-controlled, upright, and godly lives in the present age, we are supposed to be waiting for our blessed hope, the appearing of the glory of our great God and Savior Jesus Christ. And according to 2 Peter chapter 3, verse 12 and 13, we are waiting for and hastening the coming of the day of God. And we are waiting for the new heavens and a new earth in which righteousness dwells. We are intentionally called to wait. And here is why waiting matters. It matters because it demonstrates trust. When we wait, we are showing that we are not in control and we trust the one who is. I think David communicates this so well throughout his Psalms. Multiple times he will talk about waiting on the Lord in his poetic writing. In Psalm chapter 25 and verse 5, he said, "Lead me in your truth and teach me, for you are the God of my salvation. For you I wait all the day long." In Psalm chapter 27 and verse 14, David said, "Wait for the Lord. Be strong and let your heart take courage. Wait for the Lord." In Psalm chapter 37 and verse 7, he said, "Be still before the Lord and wait patiently for him." In Psalm chapter 38 and verse 15, David said, "For you, O Lord, do I wait. It is you, O Lord my God, who will answer." In Psalm chapter 40 and verse 1, David proclaimed, "I waited patiently for the Lord. He inclined to me and heard my cry." And then in Psalm chapter 62 and verse 1, "For God alone my soul waits in silence. From him comes my salvation." Now, I know you weren't necessarily able to keep up with every one of those passages. Just go onto a Bible search engine at some point and look up the word wait and see how often it's talked about. See how often David himself writes about it. See how often the New Testament commands it. Waiting is a part of our experience. And what David does throughout the Psalms is he emphasizes waiting and seems to be saying that waiting is how we show God that we trust his way. You ever done a trust fall? You know, a trust fall is where you blindly let yourself fall with people there to catch you. Who wants to give that a shot right now? I'm just kidding. I didn't think there were going to be any volunteers anyway. Waiting is the greatest trust fall there ever was. Because you have absolutely no control over what's about to happen, and you have no idea what comes next. You're simply trusting in God to take the reins. Waiting is a part of discipleship. But the worship of the God called now is based on the premise that you cannot trust God. Do you remember how the serpent convinced Adam and Eve to eat the forbidden fruit? Go back to Genesis chapter 3. And in essence, the serpent is telling Adam and Eve, God can't be trusted. In verse 4 of that chapter, in regards to the eating of the fruit from the tree of knowledge of good and evil, the serpent lied and said, "You will not surely die." Even though one chapter earlier, God had personally proclaimed to Adam that if you eat this fruit, you will surely die. The serpent essentially calls God a liar. And then he doesn't just stop there. He goes on to accuse God of withholding something from Adam and Eve that would have been very special. In verse 5 of Genesis chapter 3, he said, God knows that in the day you eat of it, your eyes will be opened, and you'll be like God, knowing good and evil. Do you understand the implication of what the serpent is saying in that moment? The serpent implies that Adam and Eve could have been gods, little g gods. But God withheld the means to achieve that from them. He's holding out on them. Don't believe what he says because he's a liar. And note that he's not giving you all the information. In so doing, the serpent caused Adam and Eve to distrust God. And once you reach the point that you distrust God, it becomes easy to allow your weight to raise questions about God's character. When you distrust God and you find yourself in the waiting room, questions like, does God love me? Does God care? Can God do anything about this? Will God do anything about this? Maybe God's not really there. Those are the kinds of questions that start creeping into your mind when you start questioning the waiting room. And when you don't trust God, those questions surface very easily. The only way to prevent worshiping the God called now, worshiping this desire for instant gratification, is by learning to wait. You know, patience is identified in Colossians chapter 3 and verse 12 as a characteristic which we are to put on or clothe ourselves with. That means it's not a trait that comes naturally. It must be learned. Just look at a newborn. Do newborns have patience? When it's time to eat, when it's time to potty, or when it's time to go to sleep, do newborns have patience? Absolutely not. That means we're not born with patience. It's something we must learn. That's why we wait. As one minister said, we forsake the worship of the God called now by entering God's waiting room. I don't intend to expound on this concept of waiting more tonight because we're going to be studying it in more detail in the weeks that come in this series on patience, which, as you can tell by now, may not just be a Sunday morning series. But here's what I want you to take away from tonight. Waiting is essential because it's where we learn patience. And that's why most of our biblical heroes were trained waiters. Noah waited up to 100 years for the rain to fall while he built the ark. We're not exactly sure at what point in his life he actually started construction, but the story starts with him at 500, and the story ends with him boarding the ark at 600. So up to 100 years, he may have waited just for the rain to fall. And you know what? We know for sure that he waited an entire year on the ark with all the stinky animals and all of his family just for those waters to recede and for him to be able to exit the ark. Abraham waited 25 years for the child he was promised to finally be born. And they weren't easy 25 years. They were from the age 75 to 100. Jacob waited through 14 years of labor just to be able to call Rachel his wife. Joseph waited through 13 years of enslavement and imprisonment for his prophetic dreams to become a reality and for him to come to understand what God was doing in his life when it came to saving his family. Moses waited through 40 years of wilderness wanderings with an ungrateful people just to have the opportunity to see the promised land, not even enter it. Hannah waited an untold number of years to finally become a mother. David waited for the throne after being anointed the next king of Israel and lived as a fugitive in the wilderness for close to a decade. Elijah waited 3 years through a drought, being fed by ravens and cared for by a widow before God ordered him to confront King Ahab. Paul waited through at least 4 years of prison in Caesarea and Rome just to have the opportunity to proclaim Christ to the emperor. And think about it. The church has been waiting nearly 2,000 years for Jesus to return. The point is, waiting is a part of the Christian experience. That's why James said in James chapter 5, verses 7 and 8, "Be patient, therefore, brothers, until the coming of the Lord. See how the farmer waits for the precious fruit of the earth, being patient about it until it receives the early and late rains. You also be patient. Establish your hearts for the coming of the Lord." Patience is where we learn. Waiting is where we learn patience. So the point is, don't waste a good wait. This evening, you may be in this moment where you feel like you're stuck in the waiting room. You may be pondering some of those very questions that are the result of distrust or doubt towards God. Maybe you're really struggling with your faith because you're not sure why you're experiencing what you're experiencing or why things haven't come to fruition. I can't answer every question, but I can tell you this. God always has His reasons. They may not make sense to us. They may not be liked by us. They may not be wanted by us. But God always has His reasons. Be patient. Learn patience. Tonight, if you're really struggling with patience, know that you have a God who is the God of patience, as Romans chapter 15 and verse 5 says. He understands it better than you and I ever will. So if you're struggling with it, bring it to Him. And note that part of the reason waiting occurs is so that everyone has the opportunity to hear the good news of salvation. And it may just be that tonight you need to hear that good news. And let me simplify it for you. God loved you so much that He sent Jesus to die for you so you don't have to pay the price for your sins. And through His blood, you can receive salvation. If that's an invitation you need to respond to tonight, then we invite you to do so while together we stand and